Reiser. My maiden name is Diane Goldman. So my name is Diane Goldman Reiser, and I'm Lily Reiser's grandmother.
All right. And can you tell me about why your family moved to the United States?
Sure. So I'm going to tell you that both of my grandparents, who would be your grandparents, so both on my mother's side and my father's side, moved to the United States in the early 1900s when they were like maybe 20 years old, maybe about your age. And they came from, the map was different then than it is now. So the area that they came from, and this is both sides of my family, was Poland, Ukraine, and the border would change. But in any case, they were Jewish, and they came largely because they were oppressed. And the men came because they did not want to have to join the Tsar's army. And so they came to the United States to avoid being conscripted. Not everybody came, so that actually families were split up. I mean, I don't know if you remember the show or the movie Fiddler on the Roof, but that's really an excellent depiction of what was going on. Both of my grandparents' families experienced those kinds of things, and not everybody came at the same time, but eventually many of them did come, but some of them left family members there. And none of them were married when they came. So they married people when they met people when they came here, and they got married while they came here. These are my grandparents, your great-grandparents. Your great-great-grandparents. So in other words, my mother and father would have been your great-grandparents, and these are their parents. So they were your great-great-grandparents. I think that at first they were fine with it. And in fact, my grandmother, my mother's mother, when she married my grandfather, she actually went back to Europe. They got married here, and then he wanted her to meet his family who hadn't come over. And so she took a boat, they traveled by boat in those days, and she took a boat and went back to Europe without him. This was in 1910, to meet his family. And it turns out that his family, unlike all of the other families of my relatives, his family had a little bit of money, and they actually owned an inn. And she was very impressed with who the family she was marrying into. But I tell you this because at that point in 1910, and even a little bit further on, they were able to go back and forth, and they were able to communicate with the families who hadn't come. And they would periodically bring over siblings or cousins. You had to be sponsored by somebody. And so they did that. And it was, the World War I intervened, but it didn't have that much of an effect on them in that respect. And so up until, I would say, the late 1920s, they were comfortable, and they were able to bring over as many of their relatives as who wanted to come over. Things began to get really not good when Hitler came to power in Germany in the 1930s, and that changed everyone's experience of what it was like to be, an ocean away from your family, because there were members of all of my grandparents' families who hadn't come and who ended up being killed either in concentration camps or in Russia, because there was a huge amount of fighting that was going on there. And that was, I think that had an impact on all of them for the rest of their lives. And it was something that, impacted my mother tremendously. But there was definitely that period of time when they first came where it was just exciting. There was the myth that the streets of America were lined with gold, and that if you came here, you get rich. And none of them actually did get rich, but they were happy when they first came over, and then things just became really difficult with the Second World War.
All right. Well, that is all. Unless you want to add anything more that you think is important into contributing towards our family's story immigrating to the United States. But I think you went over all that was needed.
Well, I just kind of think that it's, they came voluntarily. They came because they wanted to, and because they were able to do it. But I do think that their life experiences had a tremendous impact on their future generations. I think that we were all at least for me, and I don't know if I've transmitted that to my own children and to my grandchildren, but my favorite story, which is not my mother, I was born in 1945, and I was born in a snowstorm in the middle of March, and I was the second child, but it wasn't an easy birth. And my mother, in her infinite wisdom, would say to me, it was really hard. It was a hard birth. But all I could think about while I was in labor was of all the people who were being killed in concentration camps or being tortured. And at least at the end of my difficult labor, I would have a baby. So, right. So think about being told that story. No, but I do think that, there's no question but that their life experiences had a profound effect.
When reading Spicker's chapter, the historical context that led to Isaac and Becky's moving is explained. On September 2nd of 1902, my great-great-grandparents Becky and Isaac Killenstein petitioned for the U.S. citizenship. Isaac arrived in the United States in August of 1894. As my grandma mentioned, Isaac and Becky left voluntarily. Isaac was facing pressure to join the Tsar's army, and him and his loved ones were facing oppression as well. In 1891, the Bureau of Immigration was established. They made it slightly more difficult for Isaac and his family to enter the United States. I think it's important to bring up how much of Isaac's family wasn't able to leave Europe and become U.S. citizens. This then had a large impact on Isaac and Becky when World War II happened, and before that when the Holocaust began. Many of their family members died, and I can only imagine the amount of pain and sadness that they felt, a sense of helplessness, preoccupied their thoughts during that time, as well as long after. If my family were to migrate in our current socio-cultural state, I think a few of the cultural factors would consist of people holding stereotypes and judgmental attitudes towards my great-great-grandparents due to them not knowing how to speak English, and also possibly assumptions being created due to their socioeconomic status. But they would not experience the same hate and discrimination as other immigrants experience today due to them being white and having an easier time conforming to the Anglo conformity due to their European nationality. Legally, my family would not be able to immigrate to the United States today. They had no family in the United States, no employment, and Isaac's wife, Becky, was on the United States, so it would have been very difficult for them to attain their visas. They most likely would not have been able to become U.S. citizens. Morally, thinking about how close my family is now, and then to speculate how close my family was then, in the early 1900s, the process for receiving a visa in the United States now would hold a high stressor on my family members' morale. I think since my family immigrated to the United States voluntarily, they were able, if they were to have attempted to move to the United States now, they may have not even tried to due to the intense and exhausting process. Ethically looking at Isaac and his family's desire to leave their country in which they were facing oppression, today many families face oppression and violence in which they need to leave their country in order to seek refuge. When interviewing my grandmother about her grandparents' immigration story, I learned a lot about my family's history and their socio-cultural impacts that influenced their move to the United States in the early 1900s. I found it really interesting and disheartening to discover that not all of my relatives were able to attain their citizenship and or move to the United States. My family not being able to leave Poland, Austria, and Ukraine left them to live in Europe during a time in which Hitler's regime wanted them dead. Isaac and Becky's family members ended up dying in the Holocaust. I cannot fathom the emotions that they endured at that time. I learned that leaving your country voluntarily is a privilege. Many individuals today flee their countries involuntarily and are treated as if they don't deserve the same rights as U.S. citizens. The lesson of fighting against the current immigration laws to create a system in which allows individuals to enter the United States and have the same opportunities as my great-great-grandparents, Becky and Isaac Kilstein, is very important. I am beyond grateful that my family members were able to move to the United States without as much complications as the families today experience, but I do think it is an enormous privilege that my family was able to do so, and now most of my family members on my dad's side of the family live in Brooklyn, New York, and that's where Becky and Isaac lived as well, so they have that community and they have the sense of togetherness due to my great-great-grandparents being able to leave Austria at the time in which they were facing oppression. So I am recognizing my family's privilege and my privilege today through this lesson and through this project.